Today I'd like to tell you about some of our research we're doing in artificial photosynthesis group here at Brookhaven Lab in the Department of Chemistry, where we study different aspects of artificial photosynthesis. And the main topic of my talk today is how we can make and break bonds using protons and electrons. In my presentation, I'd like to start by talking about the reason why we're doing why we're studying artificial photosynthesis. And I'll start with the broad question of energy and what role renewable energy plays in the picture of the global energy production and consumption. Also, I'll transition to the particular type of renewable energy, which is a solar energy. And I'll discuss different ways of solar energy consumption and also the storage of solar energy in forms of chemical fuels. And I will start by talking about natural photosynthesis and how we get inspired by the action of natural photosynthesis to build artificial photosynthetic devices. And I will transition to explaining two major chemical transformations which take place in artificial and natural photosynthesis as well, which are water oxidation and reduction of carbon dioxide. And I'll conclude with some quick overview of the current progress and challenges and future directions which artificial photosynthesis facing as the field and what we're doing in our group as current research and further directions. So let me start talking about energy. We all know that we use lots of energy. We are familiar with energy use, for example, in our houses. We use electricity, but not only in the houses, also in transportation and other areas. And these are the energy units we use to measure the energy. So these are kilowatt hours or even megawatt hours, which are bigger units. For example, the typical household electrical energy consumption is on the order of several megawatt hours. But if we talk about global energy use in the entire world, these are astonishing numbers. These are 140 petawatt hours. So the peta has 15 zeros in it. So it's a big number. And so we use lots of energy, but most of this energy comes from fossil fuels. It comes from coal, oil, natural gas. Very little fraction comes from nuclear or other types of energy sources, including renewable energy, such as biomass, solar, wind. And it is forecasted that our energy use, even though it's very big now, it will only increase in the future. Almost 30% over the next 20 years. And the amount of energy we use, which coming from fossil fuels, may create certain complications. We all know about environmental impact from emissions. And there's also, we know that the fossil fuels, even though we have a lot of them right now, at some point we can run out of fossil fuels, so we have to think about other ways of producing energy. And so the renewable sources from the word renewable, you can realize that these sources cannot be consumed, so we can tap into them sort of on a longer time scale, almost indefinitely. And these type of sources of renewable energy, there's a wide variety of sources, and we are using most of them right now. Some of them come from using hydroelectric power, biomass, nuclear, geothermal. But the main problem with the using these type of sources for renewable energy is that they are limited, and the amount of energy which can be extracted from these sources is really small compared to the demand we're facing in the future. However, the solar energy provides us with a very great resource. We have about 5,000 petawatt hour energy per year, which is possible to extract technologically as well as economically. So that's why we're interested in utilizing solar energy. If we think about using solar energy as one of the major sources of our energy, we should think also about storage. And the reason for that is simple. And I put it in a very simple sentence. For example, if we think about using photovoltaics, the solar panels, no sun, no power. So if we, during the night time, or we don't have enough sunlight, we're not producing enough power, but we are always using power, no matter is it daytime or nighttime. So we have to somehow store this energy and use it in the future. There are different strategies for solar energy storage, including solar energy, but other renewable energy sources as well. We can store energy in form of in mechanical form by, for example, pumping water uphill and releasing it later. We can use it also as a compressed air. We can store energy as in the form of electricity, for example, or thermal, and use thermal energy storage. There is an emerging field of energy storage, which converts solar energy into fuels. And I would say that storing energy in the form of chemical fuels is probably the only feasible way to store a large amount of energy, which is required if we think about the amount of energy as a world we're consuming. So there is one good reason for that, is that the fuels have very high energy density, or in other words, we can store more energy per weight of fuel, or weight of a device, for example. If we compare fuels with batteries, for example, we can store much more energy, almost 15, I guess about 5 times more energy in form of the fuel compared to, actually it's more than that, it's 10 times more, 15 times more, in the fuel compared to the battery. And that gives us a big advantage of higher energy density in the form of chemical fuel. We can also, there's some other advantages of using fuels compared to other forms of energy storage. We can utilize existing storage and transportation system. We can use a distribution system for the fuel, like pipelines, which are already in place for transporting natural gas or oil. And we can use these fuels directly in transportation. And a certain type of energy use cannot rely on batteries. For example, flying airplanes, at this moment you cannot imagine flying airplanes on batteries, so you have to create fuels to do that. So if we convince ourselves we want to use solar energy as one of the major energy supply for us, and we have to store it, so okay, so we decide to do it, but how can that be done? So we can turn for help to nature, and as we do many times. And nature actually has been doing this process for many millions, actually billions of years, in the process which called photosynthesis. And that nature does exactly what we need. It takes the energy of sunlight and uses 2 very abundant chemicals, such as water and carbon dioxide, and uses that energy to convert these 2 chemicals into carbohydrates, which are fuels for plants. And the only byproduct or waste in this process is oxygen. And for us as living organisms on Earth, it's not really a waste, but it's a very useful chemical. I should point out that the process of photosynthesis, if you think about it, is completely opposite to the burning fuel or combustion. If you take this and combine it with oxygen, fuel with oxygen, and burn it, you release energy. And in that sense, photosynthesis is reverse combustion, and that makes it very complicated to actually make this process work. So in order to explain you a little bit more how nature does it, let's look deeper into the cellular structure of green leaves, for example. We can find these various cells in there. Inside these cells, we'll find small compartments called chloroplasts, and inside these chloroplasts, so we're digging deeper and deeper inside, we find very tiny structures, which are called combined photosystems. And these structures are really small. They're only a few tens of nanometers in size, which is about 1 millionth of an inch. But this small size accommodates the entire nature's solar power plant inside. And I'll just briefly explain how natural photosynthesis works, because it's very relevant to what we're doing. It's way more complex than this, but I'll show you the three key steps, three key physical and chemical transformations which happen inside the photosystem and which produce fuel from the sun. The first thing which happens is the absorption of light inside the chlorophyll molecules, and as a result of this absorption, the charges are produced. There are two types of charges produced: negative charges as electrons and positive charges. And these positive charges are transferred to one particular side of this is called photosystem 2. So the entire photosystem is separated in two parts, and this part is formally called photosystem 2, and this part is called photosystem 1. So what photosystem 2 does, it uses these positive charges to remove protons and electrons from water. And in other words, this process is also called water oxidation. And then it takes these electrons and protons and transfers them across the membrane to the photosystem 1, where it combines protons and electrons with carbon dioxide and makes carbohydrates. And that process is called reduction of carbon dioxide. So can we use these principles, not necessarily exact structures, because combined photosystems are very, very complex, but can we use these principles and design artificial photosynthetic system? Well, it turns out we can. For example, and this is one of the visions or designs we can use. It's called a photoelectrochemical cell. But before I go into photo part, let me just explain how electrochemical cell works. So we can see it as, for example, a container filled with water and some electrolyte, which allows the electrical conductivity inside the water, and which contains two electrodes, for example, two metal electrodes connected to the positive and negative terminal of the battery for now. And what we create now on the positive side, we create these positive charges, and these positive charges can extract electrons from a molecule, for example, water molecule, which is sitting near this surface of the electrode. And in electrochemistry, the field which studies these reactions, the removal of electrons from a molecule is called oxidation. So we're oxidizing water here. Now we look at the negatively charged electrode. So we can take electron and move it from the electrode to another molecule, for example, carbon dioxide. So now we transfer the electron to the molecule, and in electrochemistry it's called reduction. And so if we want to do photosynthesis, of course, we don't want to use the battery, but we would like to use the energy of sunlight. So replace the battery with a special material, which can be a molecule, which can be a semiconductor material, can be different type of materials. But this generic material has one important property. It can absorb the energy of light and create charges, positive charges and negative charges. And then it can use the positive charges to remove electrons from water and transfer them through the wire to the other side, where it can put these electrons on another molecule, for example, proton, which is generated, by the way, from oxidizing water molecule here and transferred across this separation membrane. Or we can reduce carbon dioxide. But in this kind of reduction process, what we make is our final product, our fuel. It can be in form of hydrogen, it can be in form of methane or alcohols, but that's the part where we're actually making fuels. But I should point out that even though that's the part where we make fuels, this part is also important because that's where our electrons and protons are coming from. So oxidizing water is one of the important parts of the complete artificial photosynthetic device. And that's why I would like to talk about water oxidation first. The water oxidation reaction might look fairly simple, but in reality it is complicated because we have to do several things. We have to break 4 bonds, extract 4 electrons from 2 water molecules, and make a new bond. And if we do all of this simultaneously at once, which I should say is nearly impossible or impossible. We still have to use some energy because before I mentioned that the the photosynthesis is requiring the energy input. So we have to use this amount of energy, and only if we can do this reaction, as I mentioned, all these things simultaneously. In reality, it's impossible. You cannot really do all these things at once. So usually do one thing at a time. So what I'm showing here, and don't worry about the complexity, I'll explain it on the next slide a little better, but what we're looking at here is so-called the reaction pathway. So that's how a reaction actually progresses. So if you start with our water molecules, and that's our final product. 4 electrons, 4 protons, oxygen molecule, and the electrons went into the electrode. But that's basically our end goal here. And if we could do it in one step, that's how we'll get there, from here to there, across this, along this dotted line. In reality, we can't, because in reality happens, we do it we take one electron at the time. So instead of removing 4 electrons at the same time, we take 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's what we're making. Here, different species, different chemical species. And these chemical species have different energies. So this axis shows how much energy we need to make this species or that species or that. I can try to make a real-life analogy to this as, for example, a person walking on the hilly path, and this person wants to get from this point to that point. It's uphill, so he needs to use some energy. That represents our reaction pathway. And he starts at the beginning, which is our reactants, and he ends at the end, which are our products. But if for some reason, if this path is not available, he has to go through a different way, going up and down the hills. And in that case, the hiker has to use more energy, so he gets tired more quickly, I guess. But the bottom line is that all this energy he used to go up and down the hill is wasted, because what he really needed to do is to go straight. And that basically represents the chemical reaction pathway. So what we need to do is to avoid to go through these high energy intermediates and find the other way, maybe by skipping some of them or by lowering the energy of these intermediates, because all the energy difference between this dotted path and this hilly path is the energy which we pretty much wasted. So how can we do that? It turns out certain species which are called catalysts can help. If we find the right catalyst which can interact with our starting material and some of our intermediates, or maybe all of them, we can control how the reaction progresses. Basically, what catalyst does, it guides our reaction through a lower energy pathway, or sometimes by skipping or avoiding high energy intermediates. In this particular case, we also want to find a catalyst which can facilitate removal of multiple protons and electrons at the same time. And I would like to point out a very simple concept which I'll be using later in my talk, which is called proton-coupled electron transfer. So it's fairly simple. It's just movement of electrons and protons at the same time is called proton-coupled electron transfer, because we couple movement of electron to movement of the proton. And that's how this term shows up, PCAT, pretty simple. So does the nature have a catalyst for water oxidation? Yes, it does. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, photosystem is very complicated. And as you can see here, that's the part of the structure of the photosystem too. Or maybe it is actually the entire photosystem too, I'm sorry. And all you can see here is not the catalyst. It's just all this shrubbery here are lots of proteins. And what these proteins do, they encase a very small, on this scale, very tiny reaction center, which is called oxygen evolving center. And that's the real catalyst, but it's hidden there. And it works. It oxidizes water fairly well, fairly efficiently. The only problem is if you take this center out of this protein framework, it falls apart. If you try to make it independently in the lab, it's unstable. So what the proteins do really, they stabilize these atoms, this collection of atoms. There are several manganese atoms, one calcium, several oxygen atoms. What these proteins do, they actually encase this reaction center, the oxygen evolving center, and they make it stable, and that's why it works. So as I mentioned before, there is no way we can really replicate this very complicated structure. We have to find other ways. So we have to design systems which are functionally similar, but their structures are different. And that's how we design these water oxidation catalysts in the lab. For example, we can compare this oxygen evolving center, which can be found in nature, to one of the catalysts we use, is slightly simplified drawing of this in artificial photosynthesis. They both have very common features, but they look different. They both have metals. For example, there are 4 manganese metal atoms in the natural water oxidation catalyst. In this particular, there is only one, and it's ruthenium, it's not manganese. They also both have these organic frameworks. In nature, these are proteins, and this is a very small fragment of a protein. It has carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, and nitrogens. We also have similar fragments, having the similar atoms inside, and we usually call these fragments a ligand. So they serve the same purpose in nature and in artificial environments, so they stabilize the reactive metal. And we finally have the water molecule, which is attached to the metal center. These are the similarities, but the systems we study, they're more simple compared to natural system. One of the catalysts I would like to, we study many different catalysts in our lab, but this one in particular I'd like to mention in more detail, which was prepared by our collaborator from University of Houston. The reason I'd like to mention this because it shows very interesting reactivity. And at the time it was discovered, it was the first example of the water oxidation catalyst, synthetic one, which has only one metal center. And that was unusual at that time. It was about a few years back, because other synthetic catalysts usually had more than one metal center. And at that time, it was a relatively robust catalyst. It could do, it could oxidize several hundred water molecules before it finally falls apart. So now I'll try to explain you how these catalysts work. So I'll try to explain you how the actual chemistry works in catalysis, and the entire reaction path, or we call it a reaction mechanism, will fit on the single slide pretty much. But I should point out that this was work of many years, and it took us lots of effort to figure out exactly what's going on. So I will not be using the whole structure of these catalysts, but I'll use a shorthand, which has only a ruthenium center. It shows the oxidation state. So there's a charge on the metal, and it's 2. It's a positive 2 plus. It shows water molecule and the overall charge, which is also 2 plus, and that's our beginning. So in the first step, we remove one electron from this molecule. But as we remove electron, what also happens, the proton comes off, and that's proton couple electron transfer I mentioned before. So as we remove one electron and the proton comes off. So but why it's important? If you look at the charge on the metal center, you see it change. Now it became 3 plus from 2 plus. But look at the charge, overall charge. It didn't change. The reason for that because we also lost a proton. So the overall charge didn't change, and that helps actually to lower the energy of this intermediate. Because if the charge was more positive, we'll have to use more energy to create such an intermediate. So it's a very good thing to have proton couple electron transfer. Next step. So we go from ruthenium 3 to ruthenium 4. The same thing happens. We removed one electron, but also the proton comes off. The overall charge is still 2 plus. So after that, what we expected is not proton couple electron transfer step because we didn't have any more protons. So we thought, well, you have to oxidize the whole thing 4 times. because you have to remove, as I mentioned before, 4 electrons from 2 water molecules. So we anticipated that after we oxidize it one more time, we'll arrive to the intermediate which will look like this. So it will be ruthenium with positive plus charge, but overall charge would increase to 3 plus. And that's a known intermediate for other types of catalysts, such as this one. It looks very similar to one I've shown before, but believe me, it is different, and the reactivity of this catalyst is different as well. And in this case, indeed, this kind of intermediate is formed. And we anticipated something like that. But when we did the experiment, so the third oxidation, we're very surprised to see that instead of forming this high-energy intermediate, we did another proton-couple electron transfer, and then another proton-couple electron transfer. And in this step, we formed another molecule, water molecule comes in. We formed the oxygen-oxygen bond here, removing electron and proton, removing another electron and a proton. And finally, by removing another electron and a proton, the oxygen molecule comes off, and we come back into the cycle again. And then after this point, we start going inside this cycle by oxidizing more and more water molecules. And that's how usually these catalysts work. So ideal catalysts will never be consumed. It will cycle through this indefinitely, but we don't have ideal catalysts, and eventually they will decompose. So what are the new and important findings from this work? Well, first of all, we found that these type of catalysts, I've shown you, they operate through all proton-couple electron transfer steps. So all steps are proton-couple electron transfer. And it's important because, as I mentioned before, we don't want to create a substantial charge. As you can see, all charges in these mechanisms, overall charges, are +2. So we haven't built up very positive charge on these molecules, and that's good. That's because we avoided the formation of very high energy intermediates. Also, we found this very unusual pathway which hasn't been observed before, where we make oxygen-oxygen bond in this proton-couple electron transfer step. Why it's better? Is it better? Yes, it is. So this example shows you why. So we compared 2 catalysts, one which doesn't do all PCET steps, this one, and the one which does all PCET steps. So let's look at the one which doesn't. That's the amount of electrical potential we have to apply at the electrode, enough to start water oxidation reaction. And as we can see, this potential is pretty high. It's about 1600 millivolts, and it doesn't depend on the concentration of acid in solution. Now, if we look at the catalyst which does all PCET steps, it starts pretty high as well, at high acid concentrations. However, if you start decreasing the concentration of acid or increasing the pH of solution, the potential required to start water oxidation process drops a lot. And we can actually decrease it by about 50% if we get to a relatively basic solution, pH about 11 or 10. And that's a good thing, because now we lowered the energy requirement for driving the water oxidation reaction, and it makes the entire, the oxidative part of artificial photosynthetic device more efficient. So you may ask me, how do we know that we make all these intermediates? I mean, did you make it up, or? Well, we actually do. So what we do is we try to use different techniques, physical measurement techniques, to look at these different intermediates. Some of these intermediates are relatively stable, so we can just make them and take them to the instrument and measure their properties. Some of these intermediates are very unstable. They live on the order of fraction of seconds or even shorter. So we need a special equipment where we can actually produce intermediates on a very fast time scale and then analyze their properties before they disappear. And fortunately, here in Brookhaven Lab and in chemistry department, we have such an instrument. It's a pretty specialized instrument that not that many in the world, which can actually produce very short-lived oxidized or reduced species. In our case, we wanted to produce oxidized species, and then we can study them. And this instrument is called Van de Graaff accelerator. So, and there are several of these, several of them in the Brookhaven, but the one we have in chemistry is specialized for studying the chemical transformations. So we can take very short pulses of electrons from this accelerator and pass it through the solution which contains our molecules. And by passing these electrons through the solution, we produce oxidized species in the solution. And this species has very specific spectroscopic signatures, so we can tell which species we make and how they interconvert into each other. And then we can measure their properties and compare them with other measurements. So for example, on this graph, I'm showing you these spectroscopic signatures of 3 different distinct species we've studied. So that's our initial form of the catalyst, ruthenium-2. The spectroscopic signature is shown in black. Now we can produce this fairly unstable intermediate using pulse radiolysis, and you see the red spectrum. And we can oxidize it one more time and produce this intermediate, and you see it in blue. They have very different spectroscopic signatures, so we can tell them apart. We can also use the power of quantum chemical calculations. And we have a very talented theoretician in our group, Jim Muckerman, who is here somewhere in the audience, who does this type of calculations. So he can assume a structure, a certain structure, for example, like this. He can predict what kind of spectroscopic signature this structure will have. And then we can compare these predictions with our experiments, and we can get a better insight into what we're actually looking at. We can actually get other types of information. For example, how fast these different species transform one into another. For example, from going to here, or from here to here, we can get an idea how fast it happens by measuring so-called reaction rates, basically monitoring these species in real time using this technique. So it's a very powerful method. So finally, we're curious, can we actually use this catalyst and do water oxidation using energy of light? So for that, we have to find another sort of way of, to find a way to generate positive charges, because we need to take these positive charges and transfer them to the catalyst and transfer electrons from the catalyst to the carrier of the positive charge. And we can find these systems, for example, in these metal complexes. So this looks similar to the catalyst I've shown, but it is different. It's not a water oxidation catalyst, and there are some subtle differences, but for example, it doesn't have water molecule attached. But what we can do with this molecule, we can shine light on it, and we can, in the presence of some electron acceptor, we can use energy of light to remove electron from this molecule. And now this molecule becomes a carrier, a shuttle of positive charge. Now, and you can see, for example, this is the color of this molecule, and this is the color of this molecule, so it's very distinct. And then we can take this molecule, the carrier of the positive charge, and let it extract electron from our catalyst. And if we do it several times, we can actually drive the water oxidation cycle using light. And can we do it? Well, this experiment shows that indeed we can. So we see on this axis, the total amount of oxygen produced in the system is shown, and this is the reaction time. So if we make this mixture and turn the light on, we can see oxygen starts coming slowly and then faster. Then we turn light off at this moment, and then oxygen production stops. We turn light on again, and we see oxygen coming up again. So this experiment really shows that this kind of simple, in a way, system actually can oxidize water using energy of light. So at this point, we talked a little bit about absorption of light and production of charges. We also discussed oxidation of water quite extensively. So how about making fuels? So there are 2 types of fuel production reactions, major ones, is a reduction of carbon dioxide or reduction of protons to make hydrogen. And I would like to talk a little bit about reduction of carbon dioxide. Again, we remember this slide where I told you about Healy path for the reaction. So we want to stay as close as possible to this straight path. So this is the same concept for reduction of carbon dioxide. So now, instead of removing electrons from the molecule, we're actually placing electrons on the molecule. As we can see, if we do it one electron at a time, we produce these very, very high energetic intermediates. So this, again, this is the energy which is required to produce this species. So now when we reduce carbon dioxide, we can actually utilize several species as our final product, but ideally we would like to get somewhere here or here. And now this process, instead of 4 electrons, this is 8 electron process. It's even more complicated. But we quickly realize, in order to avoid all these high energy intermediates, what we need to learn is how to move 2 electrons and 1 proton in one step. And that's what is shown here. So this is moving of 2 electrons and 1 proton. So we can actually get as close to this low energy path as possible. So it looks like nature already gives us a hint here. Nature uses the hydride ion, which is a combination of 2 electrons and a proton, in the natural photosynthesis to actually reduce carbon dioxide. The hydride ion is elusive species. It doesn't exist by itself, but it usually exists as attached to another molecule, which these kind of molecules are called hydride donors. The reason they call that because they can actually donate or give this hydride to something else, in this case to carbon dioxide. So what we also study in our group is how we can produce such a hydride donors using energy of light, and possibly can we use them for reduction of carbon dioxide. So that's the nature's way of storing hydride ions. So this is the natural hydride donor. That's what we are looking at. So again, we're using similar structural motifs, but more simple systems than nature does. Another our collaborator, Koji Tanaka in IMS at that time, found that he can produce a hydride donor like this one by using electrochemical method, and he can. The nice thing about this type of hydride donors, he found that he can use these donors to reduce organic molecules, such as this one, which is called acetone. And we're very curious about this because this molecule has a very similar motif to one that carbon dioxide has. So we became very interested in this type of system, and we wanted to learn a few more things about it. In particular, we wanted to know, can we produce this hydride donor using energy of light? And what would be the mechanism for this type of reaction? So we quickly realized that indeed we can use the energy of light in the presence of some other reagents. We can produce these hydride donors, but we really wanted to know how they are produced. Again, we turned to our favorite technique, pulse radiolysis, which allows us to place 1 electron at a time on our molecule. And for example, here the data here shows the spectroscopic signature for singly reduced version of our precursor. And if we put a proton on this reduced species, we see the spectrum of this is very different, so we can tell apart from these two. And but one surprising thing we found is after we produce this singly reduced, singly protonated species, somehow it converted to this final product. And we're very surprised to see that because the final product requires placing 2 electrons and 2 protons on this molecule. Well, we don't have problems with protons because usually we work in water and we have lots of protons around, but how 2 electrons end up in this? That was very surprising at that time. So, and only until we uncovered the entire mechanism of this reaction, we didn't understand how it happens. What really happens, there is another intermediate which exists between this species and our final product. And this intermediate is formed by interaction of 2 of these molecules. And it's a very weak interaction, but it's sufficient to stabilize this intermediate for a very short time, which allows transferring 1 electron and 1 proton from one molecule to another. And that's how we end up with doubly reduced, doubly protonated product. So we understood this system better again using DFT calculations, which Jim has done in our group. And these DFT calculations has shown these type of interactions I mentioned. So these big blobs here actually represent the electrons, the electronic orbital, the orbitals of the unpaired electron on these molecules. And actually you can see this communication between orbitals, meaning that there is some interaction, or we call it bonding. It's not very strong, but it's sufficient again to facilitate transfer of electron and a proton from one molecule to another to produce doubly reduced, doubly protonated complex. We later found that unfortunately these type of systems, even though they are very nice models of natural NADPH, they cannot directly place hydride on the CO2 because they just don't have enough reducing power to do that. We explored different strategies of increasing this reducing power by, for example, additional absorption of light and creating additional charge on these molecules. And we found that we can transfer this hydride to, for example, carbon monoxide, which is bound to substrate. We also found that if we replace ruthenium with rhenium, we can use this as electrocatalysts. So we do electrochemical reduction of carbon dioxide to make carbon monoxide. So at least it worked in this case. So let me sum up here what I've just talked about in terms of major chemical transformations in artificial photosynthesis. So again, it involves light absorption and production of charges. We have to move these charges across the photoelectrochemical cell to the other side. I mean negative charges, the electrons. The whole, the positive charges are used to oxidize water, and the negative charges and protons are used to reduce carbon dioxide, for example, to produce our chemical fuel. So the artificial photosynthesis as the field has made a substantial progress, especially from using these model systems I just described. We have a very good fundamental understanding of the chemical transformations which takes place in artificial photosynthesis. We know about the factors which control the efficiency of these catalysts, and we have a fairly good understanding how to engineer desired properties into these systems. However, we face lots of challenges before we start implementing these catalysts on the industrial scale, for example. One of them is stability. So current best catalysts can do between 1,000, 10,000 cycles. And after that, they die, they decompose. So that's not good enough for the industrial applications where that stability should be on the order of between 1 and 10 million cycles. We also have to make our catalysts faster. So the current speeds are between 1/10 to 5 cycles per second. If we want to keep up with the amount of photons which come from sun, we have to make our catalysts approaching this number, 300 cycles per second. I also mentioned that we use if you notice, we use very expensive and rare metals, such as ruthenium and rhenium. Well, one of the reasons for that is there is a good reason we use it because, our systems are very simple, not as natural systems. And at the moment, only systems based on these rare metals provide enough stability so we can study them. But eventually, once we understand how they work, we would like to replace these very expensive metals with something cheaper, like cobalt or manganese or some other metals. But that's one of the challenges as well. We also should consider strategies of how we integrate these catalysts into real devices. And that's pretty much the challenges define our future directions in our group and the entire field. So we're focusing on improving the stability, increasing the efficiency and the rates, and exploring different strategies for device integration. So these are a few highlights of the work we're doing in our group by different staff members in our group. We're looking at some solid-state catalysts which are more robust for conversion for reducing carbon dioxide to, for example, carbon monoxide. We have several efforts led by Jim and Etsuko in our group where they look at designing new robust catalysts for hydrogen production. Javier Concepcion, who is, I see him here somewhere, one of his research efforts is on exploring strategies for attaching molecular catalysts to electrodes, which should improve the efficiency of removing of electron transferring electron between catalyst and electrode, and also should improve the stability. David, another colleague of mine, is working on exploring different media, so different solvents, such as ionic liquids, for example, as a solvents for efficient reduction of carbon dioxide. So finally, I'd like to summarize my presentation by saying that, that I hope I've shown you that solar energy is one of the most abundant renewable energy sources, however, requires energy storage. So nature gives us an example how to convert energy of light into chemical fuels. And there's lots to learn from nature about this. So we develop artificial photosynthetic systems which use the principles of natural photosynthesis, but not necessarily the same structural designs. And among several, the oxidation of water, reduction of carbon dioxide, and reduction of protons are the major chemical transformations found in artificial photosynthesis. And I hope I was able to show you that moving protons and electrons together in the process called proton-coupled electron transfer, it makes oxidation and reduction reactions more efficient. So finally, I'd like to acknowledge the people who contributed to this work I've shown here. These are our staff members in our group, the research associates who done most of the work shown here, and our internal and external collaborators. I would like to acknowledge the funding. Most of our funding comes from the Office of Science from DOE, and some of our funding comes from LDRD, from BNL. And of course, the facilities. The Van de Graaff experiments were done at the Accelerator Center for Energy Research, which is located in Chemistry Department. We used the synchrotron light source 1. Hopefully, we'll use NSLS2 in the future. And we've used facilities available at CFN here at BNL. So I would like to conclude my talk here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll try to answer your questions. Yes.
So thank you very much. That was an enjoyable talk. The second part of your talk, we have the number 3 reduction of protons or CO2. That's a hard thing to do. You talked about 8 electrons. Why don't you do hydrogen? Why don't you make hydrogen? That should be simpler.
Okay, so I've been told I should repeat the question into the microphone. So the question was that why we do 8 electron reduction of carbon dioxide instead of doing 2 electron reduction of protons. Well, there are several answers to this question. We are actually studying hydrogen production, you're right. It is indeed more simple. Many other people study hydrogen production as well. On the other hand, CO2 reduction, besides being very interesting scientific problem, so it is very difficult and makes it very interesting. So difficult things are very interesting. But besides that, there is also a question of what can we do with this carbon dioxide? I'm not really talking about carbon dioxide which is already in the atmosphere, because it's on such a dilute concentration level, it's very difficult to extract at this point. But we still can end up with lots of carbon dioxide if, for example, we start collecting CO2 from the stacks of power plants. So we'll end up with a large amount of carbon dioxide, which will be really difficult to deal with otherwise. So from the practical perspective, it is advantageous to look at some fundamental principles of how we can actually make something useful out of it instead of just burying it under, in the ocean floor or somewhere else. So yeah, there is a practical perspective to this, and there is also a scientific perspective. So it's a very challenging and interesting problem. Yes?
You mentioned that the catalysts that you've been looking at don't have the stability that you need for industrial operation.
Mm-hmm.
How much insight do people have as to what it is that's destabilizing these catalysts?
Okay, so the question was what are the factors which affect the stability of these catalysts? And you're right, the stability of the catalysts which we study is not great. I should also point out that in nature, the stability of nature's catalysts are not that great either. In fact, it's probably even worse than ours. The only advantage nature has, it has the entire machinery which is already available for repair of these catalysts. It has this so-called self-repair mechanism. Well, we don't have that luxury here. So once we put it in, it's there. There are several factors which affect the stability, but one of the main factors is these carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen ligands. They are not that stable under real operating conditions. For example, if we're doing oxidations, these ligands are also prone to degradation. I'm just trying to pull out something. Yeah, for example, all that is, these ligands, they don't really withstand the conditions of catalysis. Why we use them? Well, one main reason we use these architectures with ligands because these type of systems, they give us very well-defined structures which we know a priori. Before we start doing any chemistry, we know what the structure is. But the way I see one of the potential approaches to improve the stability is actually, instead of using molecular catalysts, to use systems which do not have any carbon or hydrogen. And I mentioned very briefly at the end that we're pursuing some studies of totally inorganic systems. For example, in this case, we're studying catalysts which are based on pure metal and some other elements which are not carbon and hydrogen. So but we still have to use our knowledge which we obtained from using these molecular systems in developing some more robust catalysts. So my take on that is if we move away from systems which contains lots of carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, well, not necessarily, but carbon and hydrogen, so organic matter, we can greatly stabilize our catalysts. Maybe you want to ask it as a question.
Are there any other products of reduction of CO2, like hydrogen and CO?
Okay, the question was, are there any other products for the reduction of CO2 other than CO? Are you asking regarding this particular system or in general? Generally, well, depends on the catalyst. So yes, I mean, some catalysts, as you might know, they generate a wide variety of products. For example, if you use metallic copper, you create like 10 different products in different ratios, but you create hydrogen and CO, but you can also make methane, you can make formic acid, you can make multiple carbon products like methanol or ethane, all kind of products. But some catalysts, for example, gold, metallic gold or metallic silver, they are more selective, and you can make them more selective by manipulating the properties of the surface. So you can, for example, gold and silver, they can exclusively make carbon monoxide. So in this particular system, which we're finishing up working with, we can generate carbon monoxide with about 95% efficiency, even a little higher than that. So some of the systems are more selective than others.